Hello, Husker fans. Sam McKewon with the Omaha World-Herald and HuskerExtra.com. This is the three keys to Minnesota, a team that Nebraska has not beaten the last three times they've played them. The Huskers are now 3-5, and they play the Minnesota Golden Gophers, a team that has had Nebraska's number so long as P.J. Fleck has been at Minnesota. He's won 4 of 5 against the Huskers. The lone loss was in 2018. That was Scott Frost's first win, ironically, of his career at Nebraska. That was the last time that he beat Minnesota. Minnesota has a formula of running the ball, holding on to the football, and stopping the run that has bedeviled the Huskers ever since. And now the Golden Gophers are a 16-point favorite on Saturday in Memorial Stadium. It's probably the third biggest point spread that we've seen. Obviously, the point spreads don't go back as far. And so it's probably the third biggest that we've seen. Obviously, Nebraska is not given much of a chance by Las Vegas of winning this game, and that's because of Casey Thompson, potentially hurt. He's a game-time decision, according to Coach Mickey Joseph, but there's a good chance that Casey does not play in the game. He has nerve damage in his right hand, and that has played a factor in what's going on there. So there's probably going to be 2 backup quarterbacks, Chuba Purdy and Logan Smothers, who are going to play. And Nebraska is going to have to find a way to beat Minnesota without its starting quarterback, without its starting inside linebacker, Nick Henrich, who's out for the season. That's kind of the 2 quarterbacks of the team. It's going to be quite a bit of a challenge. And Minnesota's a pretty good team. I would have picked them, actually, one of the Big Ten West favorites before the season. They no longer are because of Illinois, which basically plays the same way as Minnesota. But Minnesota is still a very good team and still has a very good formula to beat the Huskers. Okay, let's get to the keys. Here we go. The first one is modesty and Mardi Gras. I feel like I'm giving these weird Jeopardy categories anymore, but here's what I mean by this. Nebraska needs to be modest on offense, and they need to have a party on defense, right? On offense, they're probably going to be playing their backup quarterbacks, Chuba Purdy and Logan Smothers, and so they got to go slow and steady, right? They got to run the football. They got to try to eat clock. They have to try to knock first downs off and then kick, play field position football, kick a field goal when you can. Try to do some things that, again, slow the game down, speed the game up in terms of the clock, but slow the game down, keep the ball away from Minnesota's offense, slow and steady. Be modest. Do not try to put your quarterbacks, especially backup quarterbacks, in a position to be chucking the ball 35 yards downfield without much protection. Okay, Nebraska did that a lot with Casey Thompson, and we see where it got him. It got him an injury, and more often than not, Casey was under duress, or he was getting sacked, or he was getting hit. And so it wasn't necessarily a strategy I said worked. I mean, outside of a little bit against Purdue and a little bit against Indiana, it's not been the best strategy. I think Nebraska has to be more modest. On defense, they're going to have to be a party. They have to get after Minnesota, okay? Because what Minnesota wants to do is gain 4 yards and 4 yards and 3 yards and 4 yards and 5 yards and 7 yards and 11 yards and then 4 yards and then 7 yards, and then 6.5 minutes later they've scored a touchdown. Garrett Nelson said it really well on Tuesday. You have to get this team behind the chains. You've got to get them in second and long, and that means you have to take chances because Minnesota's offensive line is really big, and it leans on teams a little bit. So what you have to do is you got to put some guys in the box, and you're going to have to play some man coverage on the outside, and you're going to have to get after them and try to create some negative plays, a TFLs, maybe a sack somewhere in there. If you can do that against Minnesota, you have a good chance of getting them off schedule and forcing a punt. The good teams do that. Here's the other thing that good teams do against Minnesota. They stay out of the red, and by that I mean they stay ahead. Because if you go in the red against Minnesota and you're down 7-0 or 10-0, good luck coming back. Ohio State can come back. Michigan can probably come back. A lot of teams can't. Minnesota does a great job of grabbing early leads, setting that tone, and then just waiting for the other team to try to catch up. Last couple of years, this has been really, really true. So Minnesota took a 10-0 lead in 2020, the COVID year. Nebraska did come back and take a brief lead in that game, but then Minnesota answered right away, and then Nebraska was climbing up that hill again. Last year in 2021, Minnesota dominated the first quarter, and it made a huge difference, right? So Minnesota got an early lead in that game. Honestly, Nebraska was the better team for probably the last 2.5 quarters by some margin, but the reality is Nebraska was already behind, and they were climbing up a mountain the rest of that game. And every single time they got into the red zone, there's a ton of pressure because you're behind. So you've got to try to find a way to get ahead of Minnesota. You just do. And if you get ahead, they're a different team. I'm not sure why, but they really struggle to come back once they get behind. And so that's something Nebraska has to really focus on, is trying to get a 10-0 early lead, try to get the crowd into it. If they fall behind 10-0, it may not look like a lot, but against Minnesota, it is a lot. And usually you're going to lose that football game. You might lose 24-13, but you're going to lose. So Nebraska has to try to get ahead early on Saturday morning, kickoff at 11 a.m. Last thing, Tricky Whipple. Well, I mean, he already likes to run a lot of trick plays anyway, right? Like Mark Whipple does a lot of cool things with the offense. They've got to find a way, pursuant to the first thing, to find a way to get points on the board. And even though you're modest, you've got to try to take that one chance, right? You've got to try to take either a trick play or something that gets Minnesota off guard. You're boring, and boom, then you hit something big. I think there's got to be a way in there that Nebraska normalizes its offense and is kind of trying to, move the ball down the field, matriculate the ball, as Hank Stram used to say. But there's a big play in there, and you've got to find a way to manufacture that. Because, I don't know. I mean, Shepard Purdy did not look very good against Illinois, and Logan Smothers is not a deep ball thrower. I mean, that's probably the reason that he's third, because in other areas, such as running and such as managing the offense, I actually think Smothers is ahead of Purdy. The thing he's probably not ahead in is being able to throw the ball a long ways down the field. So, anyway, that's where I think this game goes. I think it's going to be very, very hard for Nebraska to climb the mountain here. It's going to be a challenge on Saturday. I like Minnesota's team. I know they're maybe not as good as they were last year or in 2019, but Mohamed Ibrahim is a great running back, one of my favorite running backs to watch, low to the ground, tough, physical back. Their quarterback play is so-so. Tanner Morgan's been there 6 years. He makes mistakes, actually. He hasn't been as good as Tommy DeVito this season, but I still think that's going to probably happen, that Morgan's going to play fairly well, and I like their defense. It's aggressive. They do a nice job of mixing man and zone pressures, and my concern is if you're playing Purdy a whole bunch, he's going to throw, at some point he's going to throw into coverage and he's going to throw a couple of picks. So you've got to try to keep him away from that by staying on schedule. I do think Minnesota wins this game, but if Nebraska wins, it will be because they stuck to the three keys. All right, I'm Sam McKewon with the Omaha World-Herald and HuskerExtra.com. Thanks, Husker fans.